Hi, I'm Ben, this is Questing Beast, and today we're going to try something a little bit different. Normally on my channel we look at reviews of old school role-playing games, and I do map making tutorials every so often. But today I want to try something where we look at old school role-playing games, especially the way that they were played, and I try and explain why that method of play is a lot of fun. I'm also going to look at why you might want to put it into your own game. Our first topic for today is going to be combat as sport versus combat as war. In old school role-playing games, the approach to combat was definitely more like a war than a sport. What do I mean by a sport? So in a lot of modern RPGs, especially things like 4th edition, that was the epitome of it, but you see it in 5th edition and 3rd edition as well. What you see is an emphasis on balance and fairness when it comes to combat. You see things like challenge ratings and rules for balancing encounters and making sure that everything is on a level playing field and that players can use their tactical knowledge of how the characters work and the rules of the game to try and overcome their enemies. Now, I'm not saying that combat as sport is wrong or is even unfun. Look at the shelf full of board games behind me. I have played tons of games where there is tense tactical combat, and winning the game comes from understanding the rules and understanding your characters and what they can do. However, I don't feel like playing combat as a sport, playing it as a fair and balanced challenge, really gets to the heart of what makes RPGs special. And I think that if you're running a role-playing game, you should really focus on that above all else. Find out what makes RPGs special and just do that. It will make the game more exciting, more interesting, and more memorable, I believe, for your players. So, combat as war. What does that look like? Combat as war is taking the approach of Sun Tzu, where the most effective way to win a battle is to not have to fight it at all. Either you simply avoid the battle if it's too powerful for you to handle, or you are so well prepared that the battle is practically a foregone conclusion. It's the art of rigging the results of the battle before they even happen. This takes a lot of planning, and it takes out-of-the-box thinking. It takes understanding your environment and using the entire world against your enemies rather than just the weapons in your toolkit. And I think that one of the reasons why a lot of players get frustrated when they play 5th edition or 3rd edition, that they get a sense that there should be more tactical depth to this. I mean, there is in 5th edition, for sure. But they feel like there's not enough flavor to combat. They want to make things more dynamic, or they want to make things more interesting on a moment-to-moment basis. And I think the problem here is that the basic structure of D&D hasn't fundamentally changed since its early editions. And the early editions intended combat to be played like a war. When you play old school games, you can die in one hit, easily. There are wild, crazy effects that you can use. A lot of the spells aren't combat spells, they're just strange utility spells. And that all goes to show how you were supposed to play the game. You were supposed to be careful, methodical, and make sure that any battle that you did fight was an instant win for you. Anything else was likely to get your characters killed. Now, why might you want to play this way? Playing this way engages a part of the gaming mind that I think doesn't really get activated when you're just playing combat as sport. When you do combat as war, everything in the world matters. The mountains, the hills, where the rivers are, the actual individual items in your inventory that aren't combat items, your relationships to the other characters, the structure of your environment. Everything could potentially be a weapon used against your enemies. So taking that approach is simply really rewarding. When you overcome an enemy using a combat as war approach, you feel like you, the player, won that battle. Not your character, not your character stats. You understand that you were probably doomed if you didn't prepare and you didn't understand your enemy. And you did, and you won, and that's on you. That is a tremendous rush to feel, and it's something that I think can only be achieved in role-playing games. Now, how could you apply this to your own game? What would you have to do to set this up if you wanted to start running combat in this way within your own campaigns? The first thing I think you would need is that you would need an open world. You would need a world where there were options. Players could choose to go one way or another way. There was a number of different threats surrounding them that they could tackle. This allows players to actually plan ahead. They can't do that if you're simply dropping one encounter on them after another. When things are more proactive on their part, when they're able to choose what they're going to do next, then they're going to be able to tackle it in a more planned and careful manner. Secondly, you as a game master are going to have to be very comfortable with making a lot of rulings, making a lot of calls on the fly. Because when people start playing combat as war, they start doing things that aren't in the rule books. They start coming up with crazy harebrained schemes, and you have to be able to think, would that work? What kind of advantage would that give them? And roll with it. You should be able to incentivize and then reward players who come up with solutions like this. Next, you should place a lot of importance on information. Information is critical to planning and critical to overcoming your enemies without fighting or with very little fighting. So tell players where they can have libraries where they can research their enemies. Incentivize them to talk to their allies and their enemies about possible weaknesses. Allow them to spy on their enemies and find out what are their behavior patterns, what are their routes of travel, anything that they can use to overcome them. In addition, it's hard to run this sort of game if combat isn't actually dangerous. This is why old school games had such low hit points and it was so easy to die. They had low hit points because combat was frightening. It was supposed to be dangerous and you were supposed to avoid it unless you absolutely had the upper hand. By making the hit points low or damage high, you can induce actual fear into their players that perhaps they could die this session if they ran in unprepared. As a result, combat, when it actually takes place, will have a deep visceral thrill, and whether they win or lose will really be on their heads. Finally, it's important to run enemies as if they are real people. Now, this is true in any role-playing game and probably in any style of play. But when you're running combat as war, a lot depends upon the enemy being predictable. And when they act in an irrational way, it's hard for players to know what to think, to know what to do. When they act like real people, players can start using psychology against them. They can try to frighten them. They can try to intimidate them. They can do things like put on a giant pyrotechnic display using magic, frighten off some of their minions, and then perhaps that turns the tide of battle. So that's the basics of running combat as war. Hopefully that's helpful to you, and maybe it encourages you to actually try and run it in your own game. Let me know in the comments if you do. The thing that I love about combat as war is the crazy stories that it brings about. When you're just running combat as sport, then things tend to go pretty much the same way. Maybe you had a surprising victory where you got a bunch of natural 20s and you won that way. But in combat as war, when you win, it's because you came up with a scheme that the game master was not prepared for. And that is a fun story to tell afterwards. For example, let's say the game master says that there's a dungeon nearby. In a combat as sport game, the approach would be, we're going to go to the dungeon, walk inside, go march through the rooms, go through all of the encounters, and so on. In a combat as war approach, you would think of ways to make the dungeon a lot easier before you even got there. Perhaps you research all of its inhabitants and you learn what their weaknesses are. Perhaps you do something drastic like, oh, there's a river nearby. We're going to divert that river into the dungeon and flood it. We're going to fill it up with water and everything that can't breathe underwater is going to be dead. And then we're going to go through and pick over the survivors. That's a whole challenge in itself. How are they going to divert a river? You can have a whole session just based around that. But it allows players to come up with these solutions that surprise everyone and make for good conversation fodder later. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know below. You can subscribe if you want to see more videos. And please leave a comment below if you have any ideas about further old school advice videos that you would like me to make. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you guys later.